So welcome to the first episode in Leadership in Construction. I'm your host, Michael, and today I have an absolute fantastic guest for you. I'm really pleased that she's agreed to be the first guest on the show. I first met our guest when she worked at Colas, and we visited the Falkland Islands together to inspect pavement at the Mount Pleasant Airfield, which was some resurfacing works which were completed back in 2011. Since then, our professional paths have crossed many times throughout the airfield industry, so at Dublin Airport and runway resurfacing, and at Cambridge Airport, where she worked for Lagan Construction at the time. Now, she owns her own business and she's a consultant to the construction industry. And to me, I think she's a true inspiration. So I'd like to welcome Brandi Davey. Thank you.
Hi, Michael. Thank you. It's a very overwhelming introduction.
So, Brandi, I'd like to sort of start off by asking, how did you get into construction? What led you into coming into the construction industry?
I think like most people, I got into it by accident. I actually completed a master's degree in chemical engineering at university. What that taught me was about process, doing things as efficiently as possible, left to right thinking, if you like, and a huge focus on things like health and safety, as you could imagine with things like pipe ralph and what have you that had happened in the past. So I applied for jobs when I'd completed my degree, and I got offered a couple of different ones, and the one that caught my eye was with Lafarge. I went on a site visit to a project on the M1, and after the HR guy said to me, "We think you'd do well in contracting," I took it from there really, and I was fortunate enough to work with a project manager who saw potential in me, and he got the company, if you like, to sponsor me through a further master's, which was in construction management. So that then brought my academic qualifications in line with the job that I was doing at the time. So I started on that M1 project initially as, if you like, a graduate role where you're doing a little bit of observation, and then I started to shadow different positions on site. One of the ones I did enjoy because of the focus on health and safety was working alongside the health and safety advisor at the time, and a big part of that was essentially going out, observing what was going on, delivering inductions, and reviewing health and safety documentation. And I have a really happy memory of that time. We have many happy memories, particularly playing darts at about 6-7 o'clock in the evening, and then we were doing a specific job on a bridge using the Gomcom Commander concrete slipform machine, and we had 30 Russian bridge engineers come over to the site to have a look at this machine, and I was given the job of inducting them. I think it was a bit of a short straw type job, but I remember literally standing up in front of 30 Russians giving the induction, and their translator, me giving the, "And you must not do this, and this is what needs to happen," as you would with an induction, and the translator going, "Niet." Essentially having a one-word response to what I'd said. So a lot of happy memories from those first sort of early days working in construction.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So just in terms of university then, was that always part-time, or did you go to university full-time to do those?
No, I was there full-time actually. I started at Loughborough to do my master's in chemical engineering. I did 2 years at uni, a year working in the nuclear industry as my year out placement, and then when I went back, we had to do a 6-month placement as part of our master's. So I went over to New Zealand for 6 months.
Wow. And
I worked at the University of Otago, undertaking some health and safety reviews. They'd only just implemented at that point their health and safety legislation, and particularly with respect to COSH and what have you. Mm-hmm. So I was over in New Zealand for 6 months doing that. Then I came back and did my final master's year.
Wow.
The construction management was a 2-year part-time course.
Yeah.
And it unfortunately coincided with me becoming a sub-agent. And as I'm sure you can well imagine, every time we had a module or a deadline to meet, we were also setting up a new project or had lots of deadlines at work as well. So it's quite challenging actually, but it was great that they gave me the opportunity to do it, and I guess responded in kind by doing it to the best of my ability. So yeah.
Fantastic. And so how did you come from going from health and safety side of things to then project management and almost where you've got to today? Because it seems like a fantastic transition.
Yeah, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, I was an engineer, and funnily enough, this is about leadership. At the time, the project manager that I worked with, he'd said to me, "What do you think you want to do?" I said, "Well, do you know what? I'm not too sure. You know, obviously it's a wide range in industry construction. There are many things that I could do." And his response really was, bearing in mind at the time I was supporting the health and safety advisor, "Is that what I wanted to do? Because I was seemingly good at it." So, well, I'm not sure. I don't think it really is what I want to do. So he made a concerted effort to put me out on site with the engineers at the time, and to put me out with the civils foreman, so that I could really get a bit of an understanding of what the different roles were on the site.
Yeah.
And it very quickly made me realise that I didn't want to get pigeonholed into one category. So as a response to that, I started to work through in management. And I think, as I say, they could see in me that I was confident, I was outgoing, and I wasn't afraid to say, "I'll have a go at that." You know, I've always been that sort of person, really, where I'm able to give things a try and to make decisions based on the information I've got. And I very quickly sort of turned my hand to that in what I was doing on the M1 at that particular time. So yeah.
So that person that questioned is health and safety what you want to do, and gave you the opportunity to look at other areas. Is that an important aspect to leadership, do you think?
I think it's a really important aspect. Yeah, it's so easy when you find somebody that's good at something to say, actually, it's easy now for them to continue to do that. And whilst it suits the business and it possibly suits the person at that particular time as well, I think if I'd have stayed in health and safety, there's a chance I would have left the industry, because I'm not sure it would have suited me technically. You know, I am an engineer essentially, so when I project manage, I enjoy the problem solving side of things. Yes, health and safety still forms a huge part of that role as a project manager, because you do still have to do things like review risk assessments and method statements. You have to issue permits, you have to ensure that site processes and procedures are followed, that CDM is met, and all the rest of it. But I think from a technical perspective, I do enjoy the problem solving side of things as well. So I'm not sure that had I just stayed in that one role, whilst it would have suited me and the company at the time, that it would have suited me long term, and I potentially would have ended up making a move into something different anyway. So yeah, I think letting people at an early stage in their career try these different things makes a huge difference to essentially what you're going to get out of that person and the value of that employee.
That's brilliant. And in that conversation, in that exchange where you decided it wasn't really what you want to do forever, I guess you have to go into a safe space with that individual to be open enough to say, actually, I want to experience other things, because a lot of people would probably feel like the correct answer, because this person's my manager, is I love it, I've got to do it, rather than having the confidence to sort of say. So I guess you have to trust the person that they're not going to take advantage of that, and they're going to actually give the opportunities. So I take it that.
I think you're quite right, and you know, I think an aspect of my character is probably that I am happy to challenge, whether or not all young engineers or young managers in the same sort of position are comfortable with that level of being able to challenge the manager. It is a different story, and of course, having somebody who is open to those discussions and who, I guess, doesn't put the fear of God into you when you knock on their office door, it means that you are able to have those conversations with them quite openly. So yeah, that's
good. So sort of like an open door, sort of non-threatening approach sort of thing. Very good. Yeah. And so what did you do then after Lafarge? And you worked for Colas for some time?
I did. Yeah, I was with Lafarge. I was with Lafarge for just shy of 5 years, and then I got sent down to RAF Norfolk by them, and that began my career in aviation. Essentially, I took on a project to redo a taxiway, and it was absolutely brilliant. I had such a great time delivering that project. It was such a good learning curve. I really enjoyed different specifications that you used. I met some wonderful people working on that project. And just after that, I guess it was as the recession was hitting in about 2007. So the typical work that I'd been doing with Lafarge, the big highways projects and that sort of thing, they started to tail off. And so as you would, you start to have a look around and see what else is out there. And that's when I joined Colas as a airfield project manager. So I remember my first day at Colas and walking in the door and collecting my ticket for the ferry to the Isle of Man, driving straight back out the building with my mobile phone and my laptop, and basically disappearing to the Isle of Man for 3 months to go and deliver an airfield project. So it was a really interesting period, actually. Working for Colas was such an enjoyable experience. You know, we saw so much of the world as part of what we were doing.
I found that working in the aviation industry, you get to different parts. I would have never gone to the Falklands or Ascension Islands for any other reason than for that. So it does open up the doors for sure. And how did you find the difference between working on major highway projects to then going to airports, both from a technical side of things, but also from a sort of management leadership? Is there differences in terms of that?
Yeah, I think some of the key differences that I noted were among client. At the time, I was working wholly for the contractor. Obviously, now I've done a little bit of client-side work as well. And the key differences for me was in what your client was asking for. When you work on a highways project, they turn up maybe once every 2 weeks for a progress meeting. As long as you're meeting your targets and your programme, they're not that interested. There's a lot more involvement from an airport perspective. Obviously, the risk profile is much higher if something goes wrong. And have serious consequences, and the disruption that leads to things like liquidated damages, costs for delays and what have you, if you're late off the runway or off a taxiway project, are significant. So you go into it as a result a lot more organised. I found that my natural engineering, if you like, the process engineering efficiencies, that left to right logical thinking really helped. It enabled me to be very organised in the way that I looked at delivering what the client wanted. And in the airfield, you had to really demonstrate that a lot more. So whilst you might have done it on a highway project, you wouldn't necessarily have documented it all, or it wouldn't have been as formal. Whereas on an airfield project, a lot of that was very formal in the way that you went about things like planning your night. You would have a schedule that showed this is what we're doing and when we're doing it. If we haven't done it on time, this is who we'll contact. And so there was a lot more detail and organisation around what we were doing. I mean, I remember being out on the taxiways in the Isle of Man. We were completing a specific piece of work in front of the main access to the apron. The airport reopened, I think it was at 6 or 6:30, so we had to be away by 5:30. We had to check for FOD, all of those good things. I was out on site all night with the guys, and at about 2 in the morning, the planer broke down right in front of the main access to the apron. There wasn't another access to the apron, just that one. And the planer weighs 48 tons, so there's nothing on the site that will move it. At that point, you then start to think, how am I going to get rid of this? Of course, you can't think about it at that point. You have to have thought about it a long time before. So we had a crane company on standby who would then bring in their vehicle mounted crane and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot more contingency planning when you work in airports. So there's a lot more to think about, really. Yeah.
And in terms of that extra client involvement, how is your leadership having to adapt to that change in environment in terms of the client?
Well, because the client needs so much at the fore in what you're doing, you have to be able to listen to what they want and understand what their specific concerns are. Obviously, you have to do that on any project. With an airport, because they are much more on the ground with you and you see them a lot more and they have a lot more representatives, you have to be really conscious of that in everything that you do. And of course, that isn't just you, because the project isn't delivered just by one person, it's delivered by your whole team. So from a leadership perspective, the way that you communicate your plan, your program, the way that you're going to deliver your project is really important too, because the last thing you need is somebody then going out on site, and whilst they may be doing it for their best intentions, because people always do things with the best intentions behind them, they may not realise the bigger picture. They may not realise that actually the client doesn't want it done that way. There's a specific way that they want it doing, and therefore, if we don't do it that way, you're going to get be it penalties, or it's going to ruin your relationship. I mean, relationships are everything in the way that we deliver our work. They are critical in leadership, and that can be relationships with clients, suppliers, with the people that you work with out on site. It really is important to maintain those relationships, and so being able to communicate the client's message effectively to your site team is really important.
So is that the key? Is it communication then to building relationships? effective
Yeah,
relationship?
I think communications are really, it's, you know, it's, I wouldn't say overused because of how important it is, but what is communication? You know, I find a lot in the industry at the moment, people have this attitude of, oh, well, I've sent an email. So, you know, somebody once quoted it to me as a fire and forget mentality. You know, so you can ask somebody, has that been done? And the response will be, yeah, I sent an email. But they don't know the person's received it. They don't know if the person's on holiday. They haven't had a positive response back. They don't know whether the email was actually understood. So, you know, the importance of verbal communication and being able to see somebody when you talk to them, be it on Zoom or in person, and being able to document what's been discussed accurately as well. You know, there's no harm in having a conversation with somebody on the phone and then backing up what's been said on the email, just to make sure that everybody really understands what's going on. You know, you can't forget that when you're working in major projects like this, there's a contract involved, and there is a requirement to deliver things a certain way. And so if things move outside of that contract, it's important to record them so that everybody can follow the process. You know, that to me is an important aspect of contracting.
So the human element first, in terms of the interactions between people, and then backing it up because the contract says you've got to record it somewhere, sort of thing.
Yeah, and making sure that people don't get the backup as a result. I mean, I've worked on many projects where we've had to send an early warning, and we've had quantity surveyors and others basically come and say, stop sending early warnings, because they see them as a reflection, like as a negative thing almost. And so I try and tell people early that I see them as a positive thing, because they're a mechanism to communicate risk. They're a mechanism to say that this could cause us a problem. It doesn't mean it will cause a problem, but it makes sure people are aware. And so, you know, that's just one of the contract processes that can be used, but that unfortunately some people perceive to be negative, when, you know, in reality, I think if they're framed the correct way, they don't have to be.
Absolutely. I've met the same sort of challenges myself in terms of early warnings as well. And how would you communicate that then, in terms of, this isn't anything bad, this is positive? How would you communicate that usually?
I forewarn, that's an important one. So it's all well and good me saying I'm sending you an early warning, or I'm going to get an early warning. Start it with a phone call, explain the situation, go through it in detail. You know, before you get to an early warning stage, typically in an aviation environment especially, you're going to be having discussions on site pretty much every day, certainly once a week as a minimum. So, you know, you can bring them up formally in that scenario initially and say, you know, I'm going to send you an early warning for this, but it's just to follow the process. And I would very much frame it in the process side of things, because that's where it comes from. It's not, I'm writing you an early warning because I want to. Don't take it personally. This is just part of the contract. And so explaining that to people, it's actually amazing when you get to site how many construction personnel that aren't specifically in leadership or the commercial side of things actually have no real knowledge of the NEC process. And I say NEC because I've worked under a lot of NEC contracts, but you know, you're working the same with FIDIC and others as well. But it's amazing how many don't have an understanding that that's the process that has to be used. And then you know, we'll get a phone call off their commercial manager saying, I've had this early warning about this, what's this all about? And then, you know, you've instantly got this negative vibe. Whereas if you make that initial forewarn phone call conversation and say, listen, this is what's happening, I've got to document it, and you are going to get it, you tend to move away from those negative connotations.
Absolutely. I think I draw from experience in that, in terms of, I know you've worked with Lag in Construction, and I fairly recently worked with them at Belfast Airport, and we had a really good project. The collaboration was fantastic, and the communication was brilliant. Project manager on the site was fantastic. And in your time at Lagan, did you find that is that the sort of sort of organisational thing that they promote, or is it how does that work with Lagan? Is it the approach?
I think Lagan are probably one of the most collaborative contractors. You know, I still speak regularly with the team at Lagan, one way or another. You know, following them on LinkedIn and that sort of thing, because actually, of all the companies I've worked for, they're very open, they're a very friendly bunch, they're very family oriented, because what they do is aviation. They understand some of the pressures on their team, so they really give the site team autonomy to make sure the job is managed correctly. And as a result of that, you get a much better team set up. The team is set up so much better as a result of it. And then things like the collaboration, the time taken to understand the project, that real confirmation of the client needs. You know, I've that thing that like and have been able to sit down with a client and open up a rapport with them in terms of what they want and how they're going to deliver it, I think is really important. And of course, they've got the experience. You know, when you've got a contractor that's got that level of experience and is able to deliver exactly what the client needs right first time, it makes a huge difference. I mean, I sound like I don't know, writing an advert for Lagan here, but I've worked with a lot of different contractors, and Lagan really are an exceptional bunch. Now, they're not ginormous, they're not a huge contractor. They do a lot of things in-house, which obviously means that they can respond very quickly should there be a problem. And that does help with collaboration. You know, it maintains relationships because essentially you're working for one company. And you find that so little now when you're working on these sorts of projects, because they are done by large principal contractors who maybe only carry a small amount of their own managerial staff and then bring in supply chain for specific tasks, civils, etc. You know, and that's the industry, I think. You know, on the whole, typically now that seems to be, you know, how it's going.
It's an interesting point, really, because I think I primarily work as project manager, mostly on the client side, and when you work with a good set of managers, but a lot of the work is sort of maybe subcontracted. Sometimes I find, is there that connection? Is there that streamline of the workflow? And from a project manager's perspective, how would you manage that? How would you, in terms of leadership styles and being able to pull everybody together to make it seamless? Because sometimes you have to bring in more subcontractors, size of project, location, that kind of thing. What would be your advice on that?
Well, I probably have quite a good example for that. I was working on the M23 earlier this year in the Smart Motorway project. I was working for Aggregate Industries, and we were a subcontractor supplier to Kia, and we were specialising in delivery of the asphalt surfacing. So a big part of what we were doing was, if you like, being that subcontractor, so that link whereby you're talking to your principal contractor about what they need. They are then coordinating the civils teams, if you like, and coming back down. A big part of making sure that project worked, and it was tricky to coordinate because the project was running 24 hours. There was a day shift, a night shift, working long hours as you'd expect. A big part of that was the coordination meetings. So where we were working in Central Reserve, we had drainage contractors ahead of us, and then we had slip form barrier contractors behind us. So it was coordinating things like, where are the traffic management accesses needing to be, and understanding the constraints on that. So where the concrete works would be needed to be a kilometre away from where we were, so that they had safe access and we had safe egress from the M23. We're working in the Central Reserve. So, you know, safety is obviously very critical in what we were doing, and being able to, first of all, understand your own constraints. Second of all, have this understanding that others around you also need to work on the site and understand their constraints, and then propose a plan that means you can meet those. And of course, working for somebody like Kia, their job is to coordinate all of that and to make sure that that happens. Now, we got to the point from a surfacing perspective, and, you know, going back into the leadership element of that, where we had to bring in additional surfacing gangs, sprayers. We had 8 gangs working at one point, and actually Tarmac came on board as well to deliver around 10,000 tonne of the material, because otherwise we wouldn't hit the deadline date. They were working directly for Kia. And so all of a sudden you've gone from maybe managing 1 or 2 gangs and the people that involves, to managing, if you like, almost a business. You've got, I think it was up to 120 people on site every night. We were delivering just over 2,000 tonne of material. So then you're starting to look at vehicle movements, making sure that they get to the right place. The vehicles are often subcontracted. You're looking at supply chain for things like spray tankers for technicians. And, you know, you've gone from maybe 1 or 2 gangs, you've multiplied that by 4, and you then have to manage that. So is everybody available? Have they all been contacted? Do they know which gang they're working with? And we developed a system alongside my sub-agent, Artie Limbachia, who I might add has been nominated for Apprentice of the Year in the Highways Award. She works for Aggregate Industries. We worked together to develop a system whereby she did a sheet for each of the gangs that said, this is where you're working, this is who you're with, this is your sprayer driver, this is your sweeper driver, this is who will bring you water when you need it, this is who will bring you fuel when you need it, this is your technician. So she made it very clear and outlined that to the guys. And one other sort of element of that on this particular job that worked well for us was setting up a WhatsApp group. Okay. Which I think is quite a modern thing. You know, it's a new trend, if you like, that sort of every project has, where we have a WhatsApp group that essentially says this, that, the other. And actually we found it was absolutely critical in communicating what we needed between the day and the night shift, because it meant the night shift could take photos that you then didn't have the issues. Modern phones take photographs at around 4 megabytes a piece. If you attach 5 of those to an email, it won't send. A lot of company email addresses can't receive them. If you send them in WhatsApp, you know that your project manager has them. It's a really simple way of communicating to say, we had this problem last night, here's a photograph of it, here's a brief explanation, and then you can deal with that quite quickly, rather than, you know, someone's taken a photo and they might forget to send it, or you don't have the right evidence, or, you know, whatever it might be. So we found that actually was really critical to getting information across quickly, which when you're trying to deliver, and I think we beat the record, Aggregate Industries record. We delivered 52,000 tonne of asphalt in March, and we delivered the 4 lanes of the Smart Motorway for the 31st of March, which was the plan. You know, you can imagine how intense and high speed that environment is. So having that information at your fingertips and knowing that there could be an impact as soon as you wake up so that you can start to deal with it was really important to delivering that.
Fantastic. I mean, it sounds like crystal clear communication and open communication, so that you're all in it together, all working together, but it making these, who you're working with and where's this information coming from, really clear. Sounds like it really is a winner. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm probably much the same as most managers that work in a site environment where sometimes stress gets to you and you lose your head, or, you know, people do things that aren't quite right and you sort of sitting like that frustrated going, why have you done it like that? You knew you weren't supposed to. And unfortunately these things happen, and recognizing in construction that it's not always going to be perfect. You know, it's the nature of what we do. You're dealing with a lot of people, you're dealing with a lot of machinery, your site conditions aren't always what you expect them to be, and whilst it can be frustrating, as a leader, it's trying to ensure that you don't vent your frustrations on your team such that they're then too scared to come and talk to you, if you like. And, you know, I would say I've certainly been guilty of that in the past, where, you know, I wear my heart on my sleeve, I think it's fair to say. And I've certainly been guilty of, you know, screaming out loud in the office and going, ah! And so it's then underlining that and basically going around the room and saying, right, I'm making a brew, who wants one? So that everyone knows, you know, lines under it, let's move forward.
Yeah, okay. So that sounds like self-awareness is important.
Very much so, yeah.
But also, you know, having that, you know, that time as well to if you are pent up frustration, just to release it, and, you know, not directed too much at anybody, but just in general.
Yeah, I think that's important, yeah. And it's understanding when you're getting yourself into a position, and being able to say, do you know what, I'm not comfortable in this position, how am I going to manage myself? You know, things are stressful. You don't get a lot of sleep when you're doing these sorts of projects. You can be on site. I mean, I think some of my longest shifts have been up to 19, 20 hours, you know. There's no industry probably other than trainee doctors that works in the same way as that. And it's being able to manage that in yourself and say, do you know what, I'm no good to anybody just now. It'd be much better if I took myself away for an hour and came back when I'm in a better frame of mind. Because actually your efficiency, what you're trying to do, your focus, it all falls at the wayside when you're feeling that way.
So self-leadership in a way, managing yourself. So is there differences then to sort of leadership from working primarily site-based, which is what I believe you are, you're mostly site-based, and to sort of being office-based? Because even working in an office, sometimes communication, even with the people around you, can be tough, which is sounds bizarre, but it is. Is there anything that you can advise on in terms of best ways of communicating effectively? So you mentioned WhatsApp group. Is there anything else?
I think we in the aviation industry follow a really strict process where we do things like a daily briefing. Something that I do often for myself, but it works for the team that work at the moment. I'm at Cambridge Airport at the moment, working with the project management team. We have a daily catch-up, but I also have a board in the office that I essentially update, mostly on a weekly basis. Occasionally it falls by the wayside, but mostly on a weekly basis, which it enables me to prioritise what needs to be delivered, what needs to be focused on that week. And by having it on a board, it means that it's available for others to view as well. Obviously, there's not so many people around and about the office at the moment, so the daily catch-up on Teams meeting that we do is really important to make sure that people understand what's going on. And, you know, as you say, I'm site-based. I've been doing quite a bit of client-side work recently, and a big part of that has been the planning around getting projects to the ground. So that could be anything from reviewing tenders, assisting with CDM information. It can be looking at what a contractor is planning and reviewing if that's best for the airport, down to things like, once the projects are on site, supervising works as they happen, completing noise monitoring activities to make sure that we're compliant with what we said we would do to the local authority and that sort of thing. So I think at the moment I've got that sort of varied role where I'm site-based and office-based. And I mean, as silly as it sounds, it can be as frustrating as knowing which shoes to wear on the day, depending on what hat you're wearing, if you like, you know. So today I'm going to be site-based. I need to make sure I've got my boots on, and that kind of thing. But being able to communicate with a range of people and try and I guess client-side leadership as opposed to, you know, office-based leadership as opposed to site-based leadership. On site, there's a very clear hierarchy, very clear. Typically, you have a project manager, a site agent, a sub-agent, a general foreman, an engineer, etc. So there's a very clear hierarchy. You know, I'd almost compare it, having worked on various, you know, military projects, RF projects, to that same sort of military hierarchy. If your project manager is asking you to do something, typically people will go, "No problem, I'll do it right away," and so it progresses. You know, when you're working on you know, client side, admin side, you don't have that same level of hierarchy. You need to influence more. So you don't have that same level of authority to say, this is what I would like to be done. And then typically someone goes away and does it. You need to influence more. And I don't know, would you say have a softer approach? Probably, yeah. I'm probably a slightly different character in the office than I am on site. I certainly get more northern when I get out onto site. There's a few more swear words thrown in, but I'll be honest, that's probably quite specific to my character. I'm probably much softer when I'm in an office environment and mind my manners a little bit more, if you like. So,
Sure. So have you got any advice for that then, in terms of being in the office and having to do a lot more persuasion and that kind of thing?
Again, it's arming yourself with as much knowledge as you possibly can. It's going into meetings prepared. My boss at the moment is absolutely brilliant. He, before every meeting, tries to take 30 minutes or so to essentially know what he's going in to talk about. He has an agenda, has the information that he needs. He opens documents that he needs on his computer or prints them out so he's got them in front of him, so that he's fully armed with the knowledge before he goes in. Now, that isn't always possible in the modern world because people plan meetings back to back. You don't always have time to go into a meeting fully prepared. And if you're not fully prepared, I think it's fair to put your hand up and say, I need a bit of time on that one. I'll come back to you. And that's something that I've learned. I mean, I remember getting a telling off from one of my directors, probably around the time of the Fortons project, which was essentially, you replied to that email in 3 minutes. And it was quite I can't remember the detail, but it's quite a long email. So you replied to that in 3 minutes. You don't always have to be available. You don't always have to immediately respond. You can go back and say, I need some time to think about this. And as silly as it sounds, Michael, it never occurred to me.
No, I'm the same. Yeah, I've had that same conversation with people.
It was, I've got to reply, I've got to be available, I've got to tell the client what we're doing, you know? And
that's a big risk right now, you know. Everybody's email, everybody's on Teams, and you say WhatsApp. It's easy to send off one very, very quickly and not to take a step back and just take a breather, think about what's actually been asked. And I tend to sometimes write out emails in frustration, but don't send it. get my frustration out,
Yeah.
sleep on it, and then come back with a professional response.
Yeah. Take some of the words out.
Yeah. A thought out, well responded. And take the time to actually understand the situation. That's brilliant. So I like to ask the question. So what sort of 3 words would you think best describes leadership or key leadership items?
Listening is important.
Whether
that's to your workforce venting a frustration, it's understanding why it's frustrating them, it's understanding if there's anything you can do to help. So if you're not paying lip service to concerns, and that goes from your workforce out on site to your management team who are delivering the project with you and for you, and then up the line to your managers who you're reporting to, and then across to your client side, if you like, as well. And I think that actually sits whether you're on the client or the contractor side of the fence.
So
understanding.
Listening to understand as well.
I'd say, and this was always a point of conflict, but in a very positive way when I worked with Lagan, is challenging. So not being afraid to challenge what's being proposed. We were encouraged at Lagan to critically review in a positive way what was being presented. So if somebody said, this is the only thing that can be done, looking at it and saying, well, is it? And having a real appreciation for alternatives and other ways of delivering what was being asked, and being able to actually have that discussion with anybody, and anybody be able to have that discussion with you. My director at the time said that I was the most argumentative project manager he'd ever worked with, and my response was, no, I'm not. Which was much to our amusement, but again, it was in a really positive way. Our argument back with our director regularly when he said, why can't you all just agree with me, was, well, do you just want a series of yes men working for you? Because if you do, you've employed the wrong team. And we were able then to really explore positively different ways of resolving situations, and actually you get a much better relationship with your team as well. It means that they're able to come and open your door and say, hey, I've had an idea. And I mean, we documented innovation when we did the Cambridge Runway project, and part of the documentation of that innovation was around ideas that had been come up with by the teams on site, and looking at what they'd saved us, not just commercially, but also from a health, safety, environmental and quality perspective. And it was unbelievable, actually, when you went down the list to see what the resourcefulness, the technical experience, and the ideas that were coming from our guys on site were. I mean, one particular one I remember, the civils foreman at the time, we were putting in deep drainage. Well, I say deep, it was fairly deep. And part of what he had to do was bench dig to make sure that the trench was supported and safe. And he suggested at the time that in the bench dig, we actually placed the ducting so that we didn't have to do an additional excavation. And of course, it worked absolutely perfectly because it followed that alignment anyway, albeit slightly offset. So we moved the alignment slightly. Yes, it cost a little bit of additional cable, but the time saved and the mess saved. We were crossing a grass runway. Exactly. When you look at the benefits of that proposal as a cost opposed to just the cost savings, all the other things that go with it. And that's the level of ideas that comes from these guys who work in construction. It's easy for people who don't work in the industry to look at construction guys and be like, oh, well, they're a bit dirty and a bit messy. And they're some of the cleverest guys you'll ever come across because of the conditions that they work in and the experience that they have.
Just logical thinking.
Sorry, guys and girls.
just thinking logically, just like, that doesn't make sense. Why are we doing this way? Shouldn't make sense doing it this way. Absolutely. So that's like listening to other perspectives, isn't it? And being open to other perspectives. Is there anything else?
Yeah, I think the other one would be planning. So understanding, and I'm not just talking about having a program, obviously that's important, but understanding what you're trying to achieve and how you're going to achieve it before you get there. And I mean, obviously we talked a lot about communication anyway, but planning is really important. As much information as you can get into your head, your drawings, saved on your phone so that when you get outside, that you've got in your vehicle when you go out onto site, as much of that information as you can have available to you, and that you're aware of will help. You know, we often go out into these jobs with probably, you know, between 2 and 4 weeks notice to proceed. So you get out on site and you've never been there before, you've only been once for a site visit, and you now need to suck up everything that you can from the people that have been there all those years, get that information, communicate that, get it into a plan, and then communicate that so that everybody knows what you're doing. So I think planning is really important in effective leadership as well. Yeah,
talk about different perspectives as well. You don't appreciate that contractors, the people really on the job, probably have only seen the job once before they get onto site. Designers that have maybe been working on it for a year have probably seen the site half a dozen times, have been looking at the detail for such a long time that when a contractor comes aboard, you can't think, well, don't you know this? Why don't you know this already? Come on, you've been on site for a day, don't you? You've got to understand that different perspective, that actually people coming onto the project haven't had as much involvement in detail from this that I have, for example, and probably imparting some of, okay, here's what I've learned over the last year about this site. Let's have that conversation, probably in the kickoff meeting or in a formal around a coffee or whatever. It's really good perspective. So is there any single aspect of leadership which is more important to you?
I think I don't know what I would have said before we had this conversation, but I think when you go through what we've talked about in the past 30 minutes or so, I think communication, you know, and as I said, it's a word that can mean many things, and I suppose actually communication is many things across a construction site. It can be the notice boards, it can be the toolbox talks, it can be the daily briefing, it can be the management meeting, it can be the emails that you receive, it can be the phone calls that you get. And I think that being able to manage those forms of communication effectively is important, and I think it's probably the most important thing in effective leadership, in managing construction sites, in making sure that people understand what needs to happen.
And how you communicate as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you know, that can be down to things like the tone of your voice, how confident you are. And I suppose it's a little bit horses for courses. You know, I mentioned standing up in front of those 30 bridge engineers. And whilst it was a little bit odd, I delivered inductions probably every day for 2 months prior to it. So I had no issues with my confidence. I've got no concerns standing up in front of a group of people. Others may. So they may choose different forms of communication to get their message across in the same way that I would, maybe just by standing in front of a group of people and talking. One of the most effective ways of communicating a safety message that I found, and it was something that we did with Lagan, was actually doing something practical and getting people involved. We did a couple of different safety meetings where we did a risk assessment on Santa coming down the chimney, which was obviously quite funny. And then we did some practical safety assessments where we actually went around an excavator and a sweeper and a truck, and we had a look at the blind spots, and we looked at where the safety concerns were. And they were led after discussion by, for example, the driver of the excavator. He actually showed people what he can see through the mirrors. They were able to sit in the machine and look. So it's understanding what worked well. Yeah.
Again, because from a designer's perspective, sat in the office, you try to come up with a construction phase plan. But I've never sat in a digger myself. I've never really, been on site to that level of detail. I've, been on site, seen people pour concrete, etc. But getting that other perspective, and in that format, in that way of communicating, rather than sitting down in the classroom and seeing it on a bunch of slides, actually physically getting out there and seeing it, sounds like it would make a massive impact and change the way you approach that situation. So that sounds brilliant.
It is, and it really sort of gives a positive culture, because you're going out there, you're doing things for the guys, and you're getting them involved. They're not hearing it from you because you're the manager. They're hearing it from the people that are actually doing the job as well, and it does make all the difference in the way that they then themselves approach safety on site. I found it had a real positive benefit on what we were doing at Cambridge Airport and beyond, really.
Fantastic. Before I wrap this up then, I just wanted to understand from a more construction side of things, now moving away from leadership, where do you see sort of the biggest trends in construction going? Any ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a few things down when because you said to me about this question before, and of course that's quite a big one. And we've talked about WhatsApp, actually. I think social media typically, you and I have stayed in touch over the years via LinkedIn and what have you.
Yeah.
And I think social media is a really interesting trend. WhatsApp on site, for me personally, I found it incredibly useful. I can see how it could also be a tricky tool. And obviously there are certain sites where you're not allowed to utilise social media to stay in touch and things like, you're not allowed phones, but I think social media will be a big part of what we see in the next few years. Sustainability, you know, we talk about sustainability a lot.
Yeah.
What does it really mean? You know, are we actively really trying to do a lot? Now, I, again, have worked in a lot of aviation projects where we are resurfacing a runway. The latest trend for sustainable asphalt is low temperature. I haven't yet seen a UK runway that has been resurfaced with a low temperature asphalt, because the safety and the risk element of that sort of thing is so, who's going to put the name to it first, you know? So being able to transfer some of the sustainability trends that we're seeing across the materials and the way that products are delivered into sort of the aviation sector and others, I think would be really interesting. And I mean, there's two projects, the A14 project, which I know because it's just up the road from me in Cambridgeshire. That was hailed as one of the best construction projects going from sustainability, collaboration, etc. If you read the local media and what have you on it, they tell you that they bulldoze trees and all the rest of it, you know. So being able to convey what we're actively doing from a sustainability perspective in the industry, and make sure that that's reflected in the experiences of the people that live near those sites and what have you, I think is important. And obviously the second one that I mentioned is HS2 that's happening at the moment. The sheer level of resource from the industry that's being pushed towards that project and all of the challenges over the next probably 10 years that is going to give the industry, I think it'll be interesting to watch. Whether or not I become involved with it is, you know, the future will only say.
Yeah. I think as civil engineers, I believe that we actually lead the way in bringing about sustainability in construction. I open the floor to anybody that can. How can we persuade? How can we lead clients? I work in the aviation industry, so particularly airports, into the more sustainable type materials, but not just in terms of low carbon, but in terms of what's going to give best life, that kind of thing. You know. What we did at a particular airport very recently is opted to swap materials from asphalt to concrete because of its better durability. The type of traffic was going to be there, it's going to be around a lot longer. It's weighing up the odds, the pros and the cons in terms of benefits and costs, but long-term costs as well. And no, that's brilliant. Well, I have to say it's been an absolute pleasure hearing from you today, Brandi. I hope you've enjoyed it too. I've certainly learned a lot today. I hope everybody else has as well. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thanks, Mike. It's been great to speak to you.
You too. Take care. Thank you.
See you soon.
See you.